ecological crises that we're facing. Has anybody heard of Cochabamba in Bolivia? Great. Yep, a few hands going up. For those of you who haven't heard of it, Cochabamba is a city in Bolivia. It's one of the largest, I believe it's the third largest city in Bolivia. And it's one of the highest and most arid parts of a country that is at a very high elevation and is extremely arid. And it's one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, as a process of International Monetary Fund loans and so on, the Bolivian government ended up heavily indebted to the IMF and World Bank. And in a story that will sound very, very familiar, if we think about more recent history in Europe, as in the last year or so, austerity programs were imposed on the country. And they were told that they were at risk of defaulting on their loan, that no further money would be extended to keep the country running, and that there was a program that they had to agree to. And that program involved taking the publicly owned resources, particularly electricity and water, and privatizing them, selling them to a company from overseas, America, as it turned out. This was through a tender process. This tender process, for anybody who knows anything about tender processes, was highly unusual in that it was completely secret. Only people within the World Bank knew who were parties, and it was a tender process with only one bidder. So to nobody's particular surprise, well, at least those who had any idea what was going on anyway, certainly not the government of Bolivia, an international infrastructural engineering company named Bechtel. This company won this highly irregular tendering process to run the water, the public water system in Cochabamba. So this was quite characteristic of Latin American cities, where there's a center of the town with glass towers, Ferraris, very, very wealthy people, surrounded by, in the surrounding hills, abject squalor and poverty. Barrios, those sorts of self-built sort of clay shanties that are up in the hills surrounding. So there was a radical inequality. Very, very wealthy people, but a majority of very, very poor people. Now the government passed a tranche of legislation banning the collection of water from the rain, which was rare enough. People were it actually became illegal to put a bucket on your roof to catch the rain. That was a fine. All of the wells and canal networks that people up in the hills had built themselves with no input or funding whatsoever from the state were nationalised and given to the private company to run. And the rates of water went up dramatically. In some parts, they went up by 250%. And water was already costing a disproportionate amount of people's income. The poor were off the grid altogether, so their ability to actually find water themselves was legislated out of existence, and then they had to rely on very, very expensive sources of water from a company that didn't invest anything into infrastructure, but just started saying that, well, you have to click the ticket now. People were incensed, and this caused what was just short of an armed revolution. The city came to a standstill. There was a mass organised movement of people that came down from the hills and took over the city, and it was armed riot police versus outraged citizens. Bechtel left the country shortly after, complaining about people not understanding the value of paying a fair price for a fair service, and just incidentally left an unpaid electricity bill of $800,000 US. So I give you that example, one, because it's an extreme case, or would be an extreme case in any other continent. But in Latin America, in South America, it's a story that's all too common. That's just one story that is characteristic, that is emblematic of the sort of exploitation that has been suffered by the Latin American nations. First, in the 60s and the 70s, by government-sponsored militias. It was the land of juntas and military dictators, many of whom we now know through the release of official documents. People knew, but now we really know, as in the connections have been made, that many of these were supported by the United States and others. Not many of the first world countries come out clean in these connections, and that they were directly supported and trained by overseas intelligence agencies and so on. So there was a network of complicity. However, when these became too violent, and too embarrassing, a more subtle and insidious form of domination, a more hegemonic form of domination was found. And that was the sort of control through international financial instruments. And then when people owe you enough, you're able to come in and take over their public resources. So a better summary of hegemony and the explicit rejection of globalization, of hegemonic neoliberal globalization in Latin America, is from Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, who was recently re-elected. He's been in since 2008, who says that we who want to be citizens of the world cannot understand schemes that always end up trampling and enslaving the poorest. How can we understand so-called globalization that does not seek to create world citizens but only consumers? It does not seek to create a global society, just a global market. There's a neat encapsulation of that idea of the decoupling of the state and society, the separation of those two. So there are real alternatives to the idea of the tragedy of the commons as a legitimizing discourse, as an argument for why we need to privatize things. This argument that people are basically just not that smart, and that if we leave them to their own devices, like a pack of locusts, they will destroy and denude the land on which they live. An argument made with, as I've said, no empirical examples whatsoever in a scientific journal. And this has been countered very effectively by Elinor Ostrom in a fantastic book called Governing the Commons. There's the full citation at the top. Now, Elinor Ostrom is no fringe thinker. She's the winner of the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economics. I put that in quotations because it's actually called the Sverigers Reichsbank Prize in Memory of Alfred Nobel. It wasn't actually created in 1968, not in his original will back in the 1890s. But anyway, she's won the most prestigious economic prize in the world on the basis of her work in this area of common pool resources governance. And this is the line of thinking which has been fundamentally adopted by the countries, the Union of Countries, which we'll be talking about in a moment, the ALBA countries, of which the fundamental members are Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Now, the thing with the argument of the tragedy of the commons and the conventional and still widely accepted answers to that problem of what do we do with commonly owned land and commonly owned resources is you have two possibilities essentially. Is that there's either the market or Leviathan. You know, that it's the market that you privatize it or sell it, or you introduce direct and heavy state control. And it's parceled off, regulated by the state, and controlled by them. Now, both at this point in history, we've seen both of those approaches fail. There needs to be something in the middle that works, because both of them, in excess or in a completely unadulterated form, have been shown to be almost equally bad in different ways. The issue with centralization and privatization is that institutional change is imposed from above. The government or a supranational organization like the IMF comes in and says, this is how you're going to do things. This is enormously disempowering. And Ostrom asks that the sterile dichotomy, as she puts it, as in lacking in any colour and nuance of the market or the state, and that's all there is far too sweeping in its claim. She challenges the idea of the Malthusian trap, from which people can't escape, but actually circumstances are as varied and diverse as there are places. And that people's ability to escape or extricate themselves from these crises, from these problems with resource use, are as varied as situations. Unlike Harden, Ostrom's work is deeply empirical. She's spent her entire career actually looking at parts of the world, and there are many, where people still live in commons, and particularly indigenous peoples. And parts of the world where not only have these people lived for centuries on the land and subsisted and survived, but they've actually flourished. Many of them have actually, through their intervention and their work on the land, have actually created a sustainable system that, as long as the climate and so on holds, is a system that can flourish for centuries. And there are hundreds of examples from around the world which she has studied and documented and on which this theory is based.